The heavy velvet gown felt like a suit of armor, each thread woven with years of sleepless nights, sacrificed weekends, and the relentless echo of a promise I had made to myself. The air in the auditorium was thick with anticipation, a collective held breath of hundreds of graduates, all of us perched on the precipice of a new life. The low hum of whispered congratulations and the rustle of academic robes was a symphony of achievement. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the serene backdrop of the ceremony. My name hadn't been called yet, but I knew it was coming. Dr. Eleanor Vance. It sounded foreign, like a character in a book I had read long ago. My eyes scanned the sea of faces in the audience, a blur of proud smiles, glistening eyes, and clicking cameras. Most graduates had their families there, their personal cheerleading squads who had held their hands through every doubt and every failure. For years, I had imagined this moment, but in my daydreams, these seats were empty. Or at least, the two most important ones were. A memory, sharp and unwelcome, pierced through the triumphant atmosphere. I was 17 again, sitting at the worn oak table in our kitchen. My report card was laid out between my father, Robert, and my mother, Susan. It wasn't a bad report card. It was filled with A's in literature, history, and art, the subjects that made my soul sing. But the B in chemistry and the C+ in advanced algebra were all they saw. Robert, a man whose hands were calloused from a lifetime of practical, tangible work, sighed, the sound heavy with disappointment. "Eleanor," he had said, not unkindly, but with a finality that broke something inside me. "These hobbies are fine, but you can't build a life on poetry and daydreams. It's time to be realistic. A university is not for you. You'll never amount to anything chasing these fantasies." Susan, ever the pragmatist, had nodded in agreement, her gaze softening the blow but not the message. "Your father is right, dear. We just want you to be secure. There are plenty of good, respectable jobs you can get without all this higher education. We don't want to see you struggle." "It's not a fantasy," I had wanted to scream. "It's who I am." But the words caught in my throat, choked by a familiar feeling of inadequacy. Their words weren't meant to be cruel. They were meant to be protective, a shield forged from their own fears and their own vision of a successful life. But to me, they were a cage. They said I would never amount to anything. And for a long time, their prophecy was a shadow I couldn't outrun. Every scholarship application, every late-night study session, every moment of crippling self-doubt was haunted by their voices. And yet, I was here. My gaze snapped back to the present, drawn by a flicker of movement in the front row. My breath caught. It couldn't be. I blinked, convinced the combination of stress and fluorescent lighting was making me hallucinate. But they were still there. In the very front row, a place reserved for distinguished guests and the families of the speakers, sat Robert and Susan. My father, his hair now more silver than black, was wearing a suit I'd never seen before, looking uncomfortable, but undeniably present. He wasn't looking at the stage. He was looking right at me. My mother was beside him, clutching a small bouquet of flowers, her face a complex tapestry of emotions I couldn't begin to decipher from this distance. There was pride, yes, but there was also something else. A hint of regret, perhaps? Or was that just my own hopeful projection? They had said they wouldn't come. When I had called, heart in my throat, to tell them the date of the ceremony, the line had been filled with a heavy silence before my mother had quietly said, "We're very busy, Eleanor. You know how it is." It was the same gentle dismissal I had received for every school play, every debate club victory, every small triumph they considered a distraction. But they were here. They had driven 6 hours to sit in a stuffy auditorium, to watch the daughter they believed was chasing a fantasy walk across a stage to receive a title they never thought she could earn. 1,000 questions swirled in my mind. Why now? What had changed? A voice boomed from the speakers, pulling me from my reverie. "And now we call upon the candidates for the degree of Doctor of Philosophy from the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences." The dean of the faculty began reading the names. Each name was a small explosion of applause from a different corner of the room. My brow stood up. It was time. As I took my place in the line shuffling toward the stage, my eyes found my parents again. My father's gaze was still locked on me, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, he smiled. It wasn't his usual polite smile. It was a real, genuine smile, one that reached his eyes. My mother lifted the bouquet slightly, a small, hopeful gesture. Eleanor Vance. My name echoed through the hall. My moment was here. Taking that first step felt like breaking through an invisible barrier. The world seemed to slow down. the applause for the graduate ahead of me fading into a distant roar. All I could see was the path ahead, the polished wooden stage, the stern-faced but kindly dean waiting with my doctoral hood, and beyond him, the two figures who had defined the very struggle I was now conquering. Each step was heavy with the weight of years. One step for every time I'd been told to be more practical. Another for every lonely night spent in the library, fueled by coffee and sheer defiance. A step for every holiday I missed, every family gathering I skipped, because the work was more important than their quiet disapproval. My legs, which had felt like lead just moments before, now moved with a strange lightness, as if propelled by a force outside myself. I walked past my professors, who gave me warm, encouraging smiles. Dr. Albright, my supervisor, a woman who had become more of a mentor and a friend than I could have ever hoped for, gave me a subtle nod, her eyes shining with pride. She had seen the raw, unpolished passion in a nervous undergraduate and had patiently guided it, shaped it, and helped it become this moment of academic triumph. She knew the whispers of doubt I had fought, not just from my own mind, but from my family. Her belief had been a lifeline when my own wavered. As I reached the center of the stage, I shook the dean's hand, the grip firm and congratulatory. Then I turned and knelt slightly, as was tradition, for the hooding. Dr. Albright stepped forward to do the honors. The doctoral hood, lined with the deep blue velvet of a Doctor of Philosophy and the vibrant crimson and gold of the university, was heavier than I expected. As she lifted it over my head for a split second, the world was darkness and soft fabric. It smelled of newness, of finality. When she settled it onto my shoulders, the weight was not a burden, but an anchor. It was real. It was earned. Every ounce of its weight was a testament to the fact that I had not been chasing a fantasy. I had been building a reality. I stood up, now facing the audience, my diploma clutched in my hand. The applause washed over me, a wave of validation from hundreds of strangers. But my eyes sought out only two people, Robert and Susan. They were on their feet, clapping along with everyone else. The distance was still there, but I could see their faces more clearly now. My father's applause was slow, almost hesitant, as if his hands weren't sure of the motion. His expression was one of stunned awe, the look of a man seeing a familiar landscape completely transformed. It was as if he was not looking at his daughter, but at a stranger who happened to wear her face. My mother, however, was crying. Not quiet, delicate tears, but deep, shoulder-shaking sobs. She was trying to hide it, dabbing at her eyes with a crumpled tissue, but it was no use. Her composure, usually so unshakable, had shattered. The sight of her tears sent a tremor through me. In all my years of defiance, in all my imagined speeches and angry confrontations, I had never once pictured her crying. Anger, yes. Frustration, certainly. Even cold indifference. But not this raw, undisguised sorrow. What was she mourning? The years we had lost? The daughter she hadn't understood? As I walked back to my seat, the diploma felt like a foreign object in my hand. The applause seemed to be coming from behind a thick wall of glass. My mind was a whirlwind. This moment was supposed to be mine. A pure, unadulterated victory. I had rehearsed it 1,000 times in my head. I would walk across that stage, hold my head high, and not care if they were there or not. I would prove them wrong, and the satisfaction would be enough. But it wasn't. Seeing them there had changed everything. Their presence was not just a surprise, it was a complication. It stirred a confusing cocktail of emotions within me. The sweet taste of vindication mixed with the bitter dregs of old hurts. There was a part of me, the 17-year-old girl still sitting at that kitchen table, that wanted to brandish the diploma in their faces and shout, "See? I told you so." But the woman I had become, the woman who had earned this doctorate, felt a deeper, more unsettling emotion, a flicker of compassion. The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur. Names were called, hoods were placed, and finally, the air filled with flying mortarboards as the last graduate was announced. A roar of collective joy and relief erupted through the auditorium. Graduates hugged, laughed, and cried. I stood amidst the celebration, a small, quiet island in a sea of elation. The armor of the velvet gown now felt less like a symbol of strength, and more like a heavy shield I no longer needed. The war, I realized, was over, but I didn't know if there were any victors. Slowly, as the crowd began to disperse, I made my way down from the stands, my steps deliberate. I didn't know what I was going to say. Thank you for coming. Why are you here? Where were you for the last 10 years? All the prepared speeches, all the angry words I had saved up, now seemed childish and hollow. They were here. That was the only fact that mattered. And I had to know why. The path through the dispersing crowd was a gauntlet of congratulations. "Well done, Dr. Vance," a classmate cheered, patting her on the shoulder. Another stopped her for a quick, celebratory selfie, the flash momentarily blinding her. Each interaction was a pinprick of joy, a welcome affirmation of her achievement, but her focus was singular. It was fixed on the two figures standing awkwardly near the main entrance, a small solitary island in the swirling river of academic black and jubilant families. They hadn't moved. They were waiting for her. As she drew closer, the details of their faces became painfully clear. The years had been etched into them more deeply than she had realized. Her father, Robert, had always seemed like a mountain of a man, immovable, solid, defined by his sheer physical presence. But today the mountain looked weathered. There were new lines around his eyes, and his shoulders for the first time seemed to stoop, not from labor, but from an unfamiliar weight. He held his hands clasped behind his back, a posture she recognized as his way of containing himself when he felt out of place. Her mother, Susan, was holding the bouquet of flowers so tightly that her knuckles were white. The tears had subsided, but her eyes were red-rimmed and puffy, and she wore a fragile expression that Eleanor had never seen on her face before. Susan had always been the pillar of composure, the one who managed the family's unspoken rules and maintained a steady, if distant, calm. Seeing her so openly vulnerable was more disarming than any argument could ever have been. They saw her coming. A flicker of panic crossed her mother's face before it settled back into that sorrowful mask. Her father simply watched her approach, his expression unreadable. The final few feet were the hardest. This was the moment, the culmination of a decade of silence, of proving a point to an audience she claimed she didn't need. She stopped in front of them. The boisterous noise of the auditorium seemed to fade away, creating a pocket of intense, humming silence just for the three of them. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The air was thick with unspoken words, with years of misunderstanding and quiet resentment. It was Susan who broke the spell. She took a hesitant step forward, extending the bouquet. The flowers were simple, a mix of carnations and baby's breath, the kind you could get at any grocery store. But they were also a truce flag, a fragile offering across a vast and silent battlefield. "Eleanor," her mother's voice was raspy, thick with unshed tears. "These are for you. We wanted to congratulate you." Eleanor's hands moved automatically, her fingers brushing against her mother's as she took the flowers. The touch was electric, a brief connection that sent a jolt through her. The flowers were cool and crisp. She looked down at them, then back at her mother's face. "Thank you," she managed to say, the words feeling small and inadequate. Robert cleared his throat, and Eleanor's eyes shifted to him. He was still looking at her gown, at the velvet hood draped over her shoulders. "Dr. Vance," he said, the words tasting foreign in his mouth. He tried again. "Dr. Eleanor Vance." It has a serious ring to it. It was the closest to a compliment she had received from him since she'd won a school prize for penmanship in the 3rd grade. "I didn't expect to see you," Eleanor said, the question hanging in the air between them. It wasn't an accusation. She was genuinely mystified. "You said you were busy." Susan flinched as if the words were a physical blow. "We were," she said softly. "Or we thought we were." And then, the invitation came in the mail. She looked at Robert, a silent plea for him to explain. He shifted his weight, his gaze finally meeting hers. For the first time, there was no judgment in his eyes, only a profound, bewildered respect. "It was so official," he said, his voice low, "printed on that thick paper. The Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences requests the honor of your presence at the convocation of Eleanor Vance, candidate for the degree of Doctor of Philosophy." He recited the words from memory, as if he had read them 100 times. "A doctor of philosophy. I worked with my hands my whole life, Eleanor. I built things, I fixed things. I never understood what you were doing with all those books. It seemed flimsy, like smoke. Not a real thing you could build a life on." He paused, taking a deep breath. "But seeing that, it wasn't smoke. A doctorate. That's not a hobby. That's a monument. We were wrong. We were just too proud and too scared to see it." Susan stepped forward again, her hand hovering in the air as if she wanted to touch Eleanor's arm but didn't dare. "We thought we were protecting you," she whispered, and this time the tears came again, spilling silently down her cheeks. "We saw how hard you worked, how much you cared, and we were terrified that the world would crush you. that you would end up with nothing but disappointment. We tried to steer you toward what we knew, toward what felt safe. We never stopped to ask if it was what would make you happy. We just wanted you to be okay. In trying to keep you safe, we pushed you away. And we missed everything. The confession, so raw and so long overdue, hung in the air. The anger Eleanor had nurtured for a decade began to dissolve, replaced by a slow, aching wave of understanding. They weren't monsters. They were just parents, flawed and frightened, who had loved her in the only way they knew how, however misguided. Their cage of practicality hadn't been built out of malice, but out of fear. She looked from her father's humbled expression to her mother's tear-streaked face, and for the first time, she saw them not as her antagonists, but as two people who had also been trapped by their own limitations, their own histories. And in that moment, she realized the victory wasn't just in the diploma she held. It was in this, in the breaking down of a wall that had stood between them for far too long. Eleanor looked down at the diploma in one hand and the simple grocery store flowers in the other. One was a symbol of a decade of defiance, a testament to her solitary struggle. The other was a symbol of regret, a fragile peace offering from the very people she had defined herself against. For years, she had believed these two things could not exist in the same reality. Her success had to be her own, built in spite of them. But holding them both, she felt the rigid walls of that belief begin to crumble. Her mother's words, "We missed everything," echoed in the quiet space between them. Eleanor could have let them hang there, an admission of guilt she had longed to hear. She could have nodded, confirmed their failure, and savored the bitter victory. The 17-year-old girl inside her, still smarting from the sting of their words at the kitchen table, wanted to do just that. But she was not that girl anymore. She was Dr. Eleanor Vance. She had spent 10 years analyzing complex texts, understanding nuanced arguments, and looking for the deeper truth beneath the surface. And the truth here was more complicated than a simple story of villains and a heroine. The truth was that the victory wasn't holding the diploma. The victory was having the strength to finally put down the weapons she had carried for so long. Slowly, she reached out her free hand, the one not holding the flowers, and placed it over her mother's, which was still trembling. Susan gasped softly, her eyes widening. It was a gesture of acceptance, an act of grace Eleanor didn't know she was capable of until this very moment. "You didn't miss everything," Eleanor said, her voice quiet but steady. "You're here now. That isn't nothing." Robert let out a long, shaky breath, as if he'd been holding it in for 10 years. The granite facade of his pride finally cracked, and he looked for the first time simply like a father who was seeing his child, his daughter, and was overwhelmed by the person she had become. The last of the graduates were filtering out, and the event staff began moving through the aisles, collecting forgotten programs. The grand hall, which had been a theater of triumph, now felt vast and empty. We should go," Eleanor suggested, her voice still gentle. "We can't stay here." Her parents nodded, seeming lost. They had come here with a single, terrifying goal, to show up, and had no plan for what came after. Eleanor was now the one in charge. She led them out of the auditorium and into the bright afternoon sun. The light felt cleansing after the formal dimness of the hall. As they walked, a comfortable silence settled between them, a stark contrast to the tense, angry silences of the past. It was a silence of processing, of letting the new reality sink in. Eleanor led them to a small, quiet courtyard on campus, a place with a stone bench nestled under the shade of an old oak tree, a spot where she had often come to read and escape the pressures of her research. She sat down, placing the diploma and the flowers beside her. Her parents sat on either side of her, not too close, but not far away either. It was a start. "So," Robert began, looking around at the old university buildings, "this is where you've been all this time." "This is it," Eleanor confirmed with a small smile. Your paper," he started, stumbling over the academic term. "The one you wrote. What was it about?" The question was so simple, so normal, yet it was a question he had never asked in 10 years. All the articles she had published, the conferences she had presented at, they were abstract achievements he had never inquired about. It was about narrative theory, she explained, translating the complex academic concepts into simple terms. About the stories people tell themselves to make sense of their lives, how we create heroes and villains, and how those stories shape who we become. As she spoke, she saw a flicker of understanding in her father's eyes. He was connecting her academic passion to their own painful family narrative, It was as if a light had been switched on in a dark room. Susan, who had been listening intently, finally spoke again. Will you be staying here? At the university? I've been offered a teaching position, Eleanor said. A junior fellowship. It starts in the fall. A fresh wave of tears welled in her mother's eyes, but this time they were different. They weren't tears of sorrow or regret, but of overwhelming pride. Oh, Eleanor, she breathed. A professor. You're going to be a professor. To them, that title was concrete. It was real. It was something they could understand, something they could tell their friends and neighbors. It was a success story they could finally comprehend and, in their own way, be a part of. They had missed the journey, but they had arrived just in time to see her step into the destination. Robert stared at his hands, the same calloused hands that had once dismissed her dreams as flimsy. A professor, he repeated, the word rolling off his tongue with a mix of reverence and disbelief. All those years? I thought you were just running away from the real world, but I guess you were just building your own. It was the most profound thing he had ever said to her. He had, in his own simple way, understood the very core of her thesis. We tell ourselves stories to build our worlds. For a decade, her story had been one of defiance against his narrow-mindedness. His story had been one of fear for a daughter he couldn't understand. Now, sitting on this bench under the quiet shade of the oak tree, they were finally ready to write a new chapter together. Eleanor felt the last vestiges of her long-held resentment melt away, not in a dramatic flood, but in a quiet, gentle release. It left behind not a void, but a sense of peace, a lightness she hadn't felt in years. She looked at her parents, truly looked at them, and saw not the architects of her struggle, but two people who were just as lost as she had been, trying to find their way back. I missed you, Eleanor said, and the admission surprised even herself. The words were not planned. They simply rose from a place of newfound honesty. It was a truth she had buried under layers of ambition and anger. She had missed the easy familiarity of family, the unspoken comfort of knowing she belonged somewhere, even if that belonging was complicated. Susan's face crumpled, and this time she didn't try to hide her tears. She reached out and finally took Eleanor's hand, her grip firm and loving. We missed you too, dear, she choked out. More than you could ever know. The house is so quiet without your books everywhere. It was a small, domestic detail, but it was everything. It was an acknowledgement of the space she had left, a space that had never been filled. Robert cleared his throat, his own eyes suspiciously bright. So, he said, looking from Eleanor to Susan, a hint of a smile on his face. This professor, does she have time to take her old parents out for a meal? I hear there's a place in town that serves a decent steak. My treat. It was an offer, a question, and an apology all rolled into one. It was his way of saying, let's start over. Let me be your father again. Eleanor smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile that reached her eyes. She squeezed her mother's hand. Yes, she said. I think she does. I'd like that very much. As they stood up from the bench to leave, Eleanor picked up her doctoral gown, which she had draped over the back of the bench. It felt different now. It was no longer a suit of armor she needed for a battle. It was just a gown, a beautiful reminder of a journey completed. The real trophy from this day wasn't the diploma or the title. It was this fragile, hopeful new beginning with the two people she had almost lost along the way. Yesterday, she had been a daughter fighting a silent war. Today, she was Dr. Eleanor Vance, a professor, a writer of stories. And she was a daughter who was finally, after a long and difficult journey, on her way to dinner with her parents.